to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by RealAgriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Over the past decade or two, as more attention has been paid to greenhouse gas emissions, there's been a lot of public discourse and finger pointing in some cases aimed at one creature in particular, the cow, methane emissions coming from cattle production. And that's what we're going to talk about as we welcome you to this episode of the Ag Policy Connection podcast, focusing on the future of livestock production and how it relates to sustainability commitments that governments around the world and companies in some cases have made. My name is Kelvin Hepner, and on behalf of RealAgriculture and the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, or CAPI, I want to welcome you to the Ag Policy Connection podcast. If you've missed other episodes, we're currently in the middle of what we're calling Season 2 of the Ag Policy Connection. You can find them all at realagriculture.com or on the Real Agriculture feed in any podcast app on your phone, computer, or other device. Last week, we talked about land use decisions and the factors that weigh into how land gets used. We often think about that conversation in the context of rural versus urban or farmland getting developed, urban sprawl, but it also applies in decisions around whether land gets used for raising livestock or whether it gets worked up and put into crop production. And that's something that's quite relevant for our discussion on this episode as we talk about the future of livestock production. Should policy help or hinder the increase of livestock production in Canada when it comes to emissions and emissions targets that have been set both in our country and globally? Introducing our panel, we want to welcome Brenna Grant, who is the Executive Director of CanFax based in Calgary. Brenna is also the Chair of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef's Climate Science Committee or Working Group. We also have Richard Heath joining us from down under in Australia. Richard is the CEO of the Zero Net Emissions Agricultural Cooperative Research Centre at the University of Queensland. And rounding out our panel for this episode is Nick Betts. Nick is the inaugural Managing Director for the Canadian Alliance for Net Zero Agri-Food, better known as CANZA. We're pleased to welcome Brenna Grant from CanFax, Richard Heath joining us from down under in Australia, and Nick Betts with CANZA based in Guelph. Thank you, Brenna, Nick, Richard, for making the time to join us on the Ag Policy Connection.
Thanks, Kelvin.
Our pleasure.
My pleasure.
So why don't we quickly go around the horn, just a bit about your role and where you're coming from on this issue. Brenna, why don't you begin? Start with telling us what you do at CanFax and how that ties in with this topic of greenhouse gas emissions from cattle.
So over a decade ago, CanFax Research Services started working with the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Beef on their National Beef Sustainability Assessment. And so we provided data into that and supported them through their update that just came out this spring. I'm also involved with the Global Roundtable of Sustainable Beef on their climate working group as we think about some of these things, not just from a national perspective, but globally.
Nick, how about you? Tell us about CANZA as well. It's still a relatively new organization.
Yeah, CANZA's a baby in this world still. So CANZA was the Canadian Alliance for Net Zero Agri-Food, and it was officially launched back in October. I joined in January, and now we have a staff of 4, and we're growing. But really, it's an organization that I've been waiting for to exist for a while, and that's bringing partners from the agricultural and pseudo-agricultural environments, from the finance industry, the retail industry, the input industry, to the table to talk about net zero agriculture and how we can empower farmers to actually get value for carbon assets on farm. So a lot of organizations, like all of them that are on the call here today, have done stuff with regards to environmental services and carbon sequestration and these types of things. But CANZA is trying to bring a different set of partners to the table to be able to work pre-competitively on understanding where those opportunities to really scale and drive sequestration and carbon emission reduction so that we can hit a net zero target in 2050.
And Richard, why don't you tell us a bit about your background and what you do down under in Australia? And I'll apologize up front for the three of us having different accents than you have.
No problem. Thanks, Kelvin. Well, look, actually quite similar sort of timing of the evolution to Kansas that Nick's just talked about. I've just started as CEO of the Cooperative Research Centre for Zero Net Emissions from Agriculture in Australia. Now, the Cooperative Research Centre program is an Australian government program that's been around for a few decades now. It relies on a whole lot of industry partners getting together, usually led by a university or some other research organisation, to put a pitch together for a significant research program in an area of work, and that it's right through the whole economy. It's not just agriculture. And so this one was led by the University of Queensland and the Department of Agriculture in Queensland. They got 73 industry partners together, which was absolutely huge. And we took by industry partners, I mean, right through the supply chain, from multinational agri-food companies to retailers to input suppliers, and then the research providers as well. So we've got 11 universities, all the state governments in Australia, all involved. Between them all, they committed $87 million in cash into the program, which was matched dollar for dollar by the Australian government, and with in-kind contributions as well. It's about a $300 million program, which is the largest cooperative research centre that's ever been funded by the Australian government, which is just an indication of how much interest and really how much urgency there is at the moment in this area, and particularly into this concept, which is about, as you know, just exactly as Nick was talking about, scaling up commercial opportunities to deliver net zero solutions to farmers right across agriculture.
We'll have to invite you back, Richard, for an episode where we talk about funding research as well. It sounds like that Australian model, again, an interesting template there that we could probably learn from as well. Brenna, to set the stage, though, for our conversation in terms of methane emissions from cattle production, what do we know about the role that cattle have in, we of course see those pie charts of where the emissions in Canada come from, and livestock is often one of those slices on the pie. What do we know about the sources and impacts of methane emissions from livestock production here?
Yeah, so the National Beef Sustainability Assessment that just came out this spring shows that, farming is 83% of the beef supply chain emissions, and that's why the focus is on the farm. And enteric methane is 61% of that, which is why there's a huge focus on reducing methane emissions. Feed is the second largest at 21%, and then manure at 17%. And so those are sort of the big buckets where a lot of the focus and effort goes to.
So that's on the emission side of things. Should we also mention at this point the sequestration there's also that needs to be part of these conversations about cattle as well, the sequestration that happens on grasslands?
Absolutely. And this is an area where the research still is needed. And there's actually a lot of research ongoing right now. And part of that is Canada's a big country, understanding where things are at from coast to coast under different climatic regions, as well as soil types and vegetative types. One of the things that has been done in terms of healthy rangeland in particular, that hasn't been disturbed, that's been under grazing, and good grazing management for decades, is that it's assumed to be in equilibrium. And I think that's one that for a lot of producers can be disappointing. But there are still opportunities that we need to recognize that there is potential for improvements, particularly on tame pasture and in areas that have been previously degraded in terms of improving soil health. And I think that's one where it can get producers really excited about the potential of doing that and partnering with research and actually getting measurements done on their farm.
So Nick, Brenna's talking about opportunities. What do you see as policies or potential areas that are relevant when it comes to addressing the emissions or reducing emissions from cattle production in Canada?
So one of the biggest things I look at when I look at cattle is, I mean, the major emission is methane, and methane has a significantly larger greenhouse warming potential than CO2. So anything we can do to reduce the emission of methane or get it closer to CO2, we're having a significant hit on what are the emissions of the agricultural sector. So that's something that's really important, is that it's that all emissions aren't created equally, and methane is a pretty heavy hitter. So there's an opportunity here, I think, to really capitalize and say this is a sector that's engaged, that's smart, that's well funded, that's educated, that we could put the right funding behind and engage in the right way. There's an opportunity to benefit those rural communities with the resources around something like a carbon asset, or the reduction of that asset being emitted into the atmosphere, and at the same time helping hit our Team Canada targets of hitting net zero by 2050. So what Canada has done is we've, with the help of BCG and some other partners, have looked at what are the opportunities around methane, and specifically around things like anaerobic biodigestion. And there are four key areas that stood out. And one is advocacy. The Canadian system doesn't have the same legislative or regulatory systems or incentives like some of the other regions that are leading the way. We also have like Brenna said, I mean, it's a huge country. So looking at where are there regional opportunities for advice, what that looks like in Alberta is different than Ontario, is different than Quebec. So like, well, a cow is a cow is a cow. We raise them in different ways, and our fields look different and our feed looks different. And that's important to take into consideration. And then the last two areas are around that market assessment, like I was talking about, around what is there potential for marketing a methane credit or something associated with that methane asset because of its 28 times GHG warming potential compared to CO2. And then the last one is looking at how can we optimize what we're doing. So getting funds together, getting funds and putting them where we need them, which is on farms, so that we can help those who want to be engaged, the operators that want to be engaged, the farmers that want to be engaged, to actually do something that's profitable in this kind of a world.
Richard, what's happening in Australia on this front in terms of reducing emissions from ruminants?
So look, where the CRC is going to be focusing on, and where it's ideally set up to do, just because of the way it's been constructed, is that what will deliver the biggest result is stacked technologies, a whole lot of things that go together into a farming system. And I think that, that's been missed a little bit in some of the hype around potential solutions up until now, where as normal, we all look for a silver bullet, and, whether it's Asparagopsis or something like that, and it's going to fix everything. It's not, right? There's just not going to be a silver bullet. That's not the way agriculture works. It's a whole lot of things that go together. But what I'm excited about is when you do start to look at what's happening across a whole range of areas and the way they can be combined to add up to a very significant reduction in methane emissions from cattle in particular. If you start with the genetics and the improvements that we're getting in just the performance of animals from their genetic composition, if you go through to the handling, just even things like the better practice around handling animals, and that has an impact on whole of life training. The pasture improvement, that's one of the things that excites me most in Australia, looking at some of the very close to market new varieties that are coming through that have lower methane emissions potential just from grazing different pastures. The rumen manipulation, so active compounds, a whole bunch of different ones, not just Asparagopsis, and the way that they're delivered into the animals through different techniques. Fertilizers that go onto the pastures that are lower emitting fertilizers. And you start to add all those up, and then also introduce the net bit of the equation with the possibility of solar and wind and hydrogen generation and these other things that come into a farm business as well. And, though all those gains start to get very significant. Now, what we need to do a lot better to enable all of those things, though, is from an R&D side, they tend to happen in isolation and little siloed areas, depending on the commodity or the research institution or whatever. Pulling those together into a whole farm system where the benefits of all those things being stacked together can actually be demonstrated and proved to farmers is what we need to do better at. And then the policy environment that enables all those things to be rewarded as a system rather than individual bits as well, again, is not it's lacking in Australia, the methodologies that would account for all of those things together. And that's because it's hard. It's hard to account for all of those things together. It's easier to do one by one. But that's not the way we're going to get progress, I don't think.
Brenna, how do you, Richard just mentioned no silver bullets. I know in Canada there was a fair bit of excitement a month or two ago when there was a feed additive that was approved that has characteristics that are supposed to reduce methane emissions. Where are we at in terms of implementing some of these ideas here in Canada?
Well, first of all, I just want to emphasize Richard's comment of no silver bullet and the fact that it's the lots of little things that producers have done daily, historically, that have got us to where we are today. And I think it's really important to recognize that the progress that we have made at this point, we have research that shows that between 1981 and 2011, emissions intensity in Canada was reduced by 15%. And then the most recent report that between 2014 and 2021, we reduced it by another 15%. And this is that whole concept of lots of little things that producers have been doing because they make economic sense on their operations. It's about feed efficiency. It's about the daily management aspect that producers are doing. And I think keeping that in mind and recognizing these are things that producers are doing that are compounding as we move forward, and they continue to do those things. In terms of the approval that was announced this spring, I think there's lots of questions about cost benefit for it and ensuring that there is a reliable supply to the marketplace. But also the question of if you're paying for a product like this, is there going to be a protocol that producers can utilize for a carbon credit to actually see that financial benefit in doing so and provide that market signal for producers to adopt it?
Where are we at on that right now? Environment and Climate Change Canada was holding consultations on a carbon offset protocol for enteric emissions earlier in winter, right? Where is that process at? And is it going to come from that type of credit, or will it be something in the private market, or maybe an inset? There's different ways of, Nick can maybe expand on this as well in terms of the different potential ways of monetizing these types of credits.
Well, just to clarify, the REMI protocol by the federal government, it is for feed efficiency improvements. So not all of these feed additives provide a measurable feed efficiency improvement if they are designed to reduce the methane without that performance benefit. And so that REMI protocol is only suitable for those products that provide the performance benefit. And there is work being done in terms of voluntary protocols. And maybe Nick has more information on that.
Yeah, I can build on that, Brenna. I mean,
can you expand on that?
There are a couple of different ways that carbon credits are typically, or carbon assets are valued in the systems we have. And the most obvious one that most of us know are offsets. So this is that concept where if it doesn't matter where I sell it, but if I have a credit and I sequester carbon using a methodology that's peer reviewed and solid and accepted in the industry, and I can say, okay, I have a credit to sell. Who wants to buy it? It could be you, Kelvin. It could be someone in China. It could be someone in the UK. It could be Richard down in Australia, and I can just sell it to the highest bidder. So that's the easiest way, but at the same time, it's one of the hardest ways because it lends itself a lot to potential greenwashing. It lends itself a lot to I'm not understanding what the credit is or where it comes from and the transparency behind it. So that's led to a significant amount of verification required. So a lot of third-party cash needs to go in to verify that this is a legitimate thing and the sale is legitimate and it's not being sold twice and all of these other issues. And all of this is governed typically by the guidance through the greenhouse gas protocol, the GHG protocol, that's used largely to allow companies to hit their science-based targets that they've set around net zero and climate. The next one down the line is our carbon insets. And what I'm calling a carbon inset is something from your supply shed or your supply chain. So if I'm sourcing grain from southern Saskatchewan, I'm going to know I'm going to purchase credits from southern Saskatchewan, so I understand. We for the most part we understand what kind of practices are being used. We understand what kind of soil is going to be in that region where I'm sourcing it from. What kind of grain is being grown, or cattle, or whatever it is, and there's a connection piece there. It's usually a part of my supply chain too. So it allows me to have a relationship either up or down the chain a little bit to say, is there an opportunity for me to help incentivize the practices that could be beneficial to what I'm trying to do? The third and most beneficial in my mind is a low emission commodity. And this is kind of where Richard's talking about it from a genetics perspective. If we know for a specific type of animal, cow A produces less emission than cow B, then it doesn't matter, and that's end of the ballgame. We know what that is. We know what percentage of emission reduction is there at a conservative level. So we're not overstating anything, and now we know that every pound of meat I get from that type of animal is this percent less emission per pound of meat, and that's by far it takes a lot of upfront work to get the life cycle analysis to understand what that looks like. It's usually around things like genetics and specific practices around where you know exactly who you're getting your product from. But it definitely increases the transparency, and it increases the relationship and trust through the system of the person who's buying the credit and the person who's selling the credit. So that's kind of, if we're breaking it down into sort of three buckets, those are the three that I would put the valuation structure on.
Is it just me, or have offsets kind of fallen out of favor here the last few months? It feels like there's more negative discussion about greenwashing and those types of things.
They're not as sexy as they used to be, that's for sure. Yeah.
What do you see, Richard, down under in terms of the monetization potential for these carbon assets?
Definitely more skepticism, or actually wariness is probably a better word than skepticism, from farmers about offset markets, just as they become more aware of what they are and start asking more questions, particularly around the risk associated with permanency, with a lot of the methodologies, and in harsh climates like Australia, when we're subject to fires and droughts, and what that can do to depleting your carbon asset and the risk around doing that. So just more questions being asked, healthy questions. I think everyone realizes that there needs to be a carbon market of some kind. But how we make that legitimate, reliable, and have a genuine impact on trying to achieve net zero, I think we've still got a fair bit of understanding in how to do that. And one of the things that we really need to do that well, that sort of Nick was approaching a little bit there then, is the measurement and validation systems that are just so lacking at a farm level, particularly ones that go beyond modelling approaches. We rely very heavily on modelling at the moment. But that sort of direct measurement of emissions, particularly with livestock, is really quite difficult. And that will be a focus of some of the early research coming out of this CRC, is measurement systems on farm. Because without those, things like improved genetics, virtually every other trait you can measure on farm, weight gain, condition, all those sorts of things you can measure on farm to know whether you are getting what you're expecting out of that genetic improvement. We won't know that with emissions at a farm level and an animal level until we can come up with better measurement and validation methodologies and technologies.
Was in terms of the question about where government should be involved in this or could be involved in this, is that where you see a role for government, Richard, in terms of supporting that research and that data collection?
Yeah, very much because it is facilitating that really good data collection that then goes to the understanding of what the national inventory is, that is for the public good. It's for the benefit of everyone to know whether the technologies are being invested in, the commercial solutions that are being delivered are actually doing what they're supposed to do.
Brenna, what do you see as the role for government in this? And I know on a previous episode of talking about environmental policy, we spent a fair bit of time discussing sticks versus carrots and that type of policy. And of course, producers, we don't want to see sticks. So and what do these carrots look like, I guess, and what's the role for government in on this policy?
Research is really critical, and I would say that we know a whole lot more in confined feeding settings because we just have so much better control there in terms of even the record keeping systems, in terms of what we get out of those systems. The research necessary at a cow-calf level, given the diversity in not just Canada, but lots of countries, even Australia, there's significant diversity there. But those measurement and validation systems on the cow-calf level are really challenging right now. And it's an area that needs significant investment to make sure that we have the accuracy to make statements that change actually has happened. In terms of government's role, we've seen the negative impact of the stick approach in other countries, and we talked about that previously, and the unintended consequences when you have countries with relatively low emissions intensity reducing production, and you end up with countries with higher emissions intensity actually increasing production, and it actually makes the global beef sector worse off in terms of our emission profile. And so I think it's really important that governments recognize that that isn't just a potential, it's real and it's happening, because there have been countries that have taken that approach. But in terms of the carrot approach, one of the things that some are thinking about right now is how do we have things that result in permanent change in practice. And I mentioned earlier the fact that we've had these incremental changes that have happened. And because producers have changed the way that they do things because they benefit their operation, they have been permanent changes. And that's really important for this conversation about permanently reducing and mitigating emissions, and also sequestering. You don't want a government program that comes in and provides an incentive that changes the practice, and when the dollars are gone, the practice reverts right back, because that's the only thing that was providing it. And that's why having market solutions like Nick's been talking about are so important, that the market is there that actually drives this and continues to show the demand for producers to make this actually a permanent change.
Going back to, those are great points, Brenna. Going back to the actual data collection that needs to and research that needs to happen on the cow-calf side of things. If I'm a cow-calf producer, I'm probably not too excited about somebody coming to the farm and measuring how much of something bad is happening on our farm. Does there need to be, again, some sort of incentive to allow for that to happen, or how do we get past that? That seems to be a pretty maybe a cultural barrier that is an issue on this topic, and I think a lot of producers could relate to that type of sentiment.
I think data privacy is really important for producers, and it has to be respected. I think there are ways of collaborating with researchers to progress this area of research that does protect producer privacy and confidentiality with that collaboration. And the Living Labs are an initiative that is doing that with producers, where they connect those researchers directly with producers on farm. to get those soil samples done, which really are only feasible cost-wise in a research project type setting.
Okay. And I don't mean to stereotype cattle producers at all. I think anybody in society doesn't like to be told to look at people flying planes and while telling us we should be reducing emissions too. That there's examples all around of people not wanting their own emissions pointed out, so or that they're associated with pointed out. So, Nick, when it comes to government policy here, what do you? I don't think I've asked you this question yet. Richard and Brenna have answered, but what do you see as the role for government in terms of driving these incentives to reduce emissions in livestock production?
Yeah, and so first I'll start by building off of sort of that last piece that Brenna's talking about. I mean, well, both of you are talking about. I mean, nobody likes to be told what you're doing bad and how badly you're doing it. But the inverse is the opposite. So, I mean, for a while I worked with the climate consultant working with the supply chains, and it was the idea that, okay, if we have our beef supply chain, I need to use the emission factor for beef that's Canada-wide, if that's the only emission factor available to me. But if I know that I'm working with some innovative growers and innovative producers in X or Y place, then there's an incentive for me as part of the industry to reach down and say, let's see if we can, let's show them up. Let's show how good we are. And I mean, there has to be an incentive still. I think that's a key piece, right? There has to be that market demand. That's a key piece. But it also is a way for understanding how data can be used to actually celebrate the good stuff the grower's doing instead of being that stick. And that's an important piece. I do think that it involves both a carrot and a stick from a government perspective. I don't think the stick needs to be used on farmers. I think it needs to be used on the supporting industry, so to speak. And what I mean by that is when we've done some research on biodigesters, so coming out the other end, that 17 to 20% of emissions that comes from manure. There's such a huge upfront cost with building something like a biodigester and getting it working and running. It's not about culture change necessarily. It is about money. And then if we know that the model works, if we know the technology works, if we know that in that situation, it can be financially profitable, but there's the upfront CapEx that we don't have. This is where I think there's an opportunity to look at where the incentives around things like investment tax credits, where the things around understanding what we could do with the clean fuels regulation to include something like biogas coming off farm. So clean fuels regulation is there. It just doesn't include anaerobic biodigestion off farm. So is there an opportunity to do some of these little steps that way? Talk about blend mandates, talk about renewable energy pricing for utility regulators, talking about agricultural biogas protocols that don't exist in all of our provinces, but do in some. So some of these different features that are used in other parts of the world, in the US, in Europe, in other places where they have actually, competitive and profitable agricultural biodigesters on the landscape, we don't really have those policy tools in place. Whether the instruments to drive investment onto the farm, but also from the regulatory perspective to say, hey, this is a renewable natural gas that we should be able to use from the farm in the rest of society.
Nick, you talked about this concept of low carbon intensity commodities before. Yeah. From a practical perspective, how do you see that being set up in the market? Do you see that being run through individual companies, marketing that as part of their brand, a value add component to their customers, or how do you see that type of structure taking place?
Yeah, so it really depends on the company and their model. I mean, some companies who have those direct contracts to specific groups of producers, they have those relationships. They can build out that low emission product right there with them directly, with that incentive, and market it as such. I think there's another side of it where, as a region or as a supply shed or as a country, we could go forward and say this is what we're doing with our beef in this situation, and this is why it's a lower emission. And so it can work as a Team Canada approach as well, to say this is what we're driving towards. It takes a lot of data to prove that, but it could also just be that this is the aspiration that we're moving towards. And it can then drive companies to say, hey, that's something I want. And I do have net zero targets, and that is an industry that I want to be involved. I am involved in, and if that stuff's going on already, I might as well take advantage of it. So there are all of these tools and levers that we have to pull. And I think it was you, Richard, who said it. I mean, there's no silver bullet. We need about 5 bronze bullets or something to be able to tackle this.
Don't want to make this awkward Canada Australia carbon intensity score contest here or anything, but
yeah, I didn't mean to pull that out, Richard. Sorry, I was just trying to make a point.
I didn't look up I don't know where Australian beef ranks in compared to Canada either, so we won't make that comparison here. But Richard, when you hear about these types of models or this concept that Nick is talking about, do you see some of that unfolding in Australia?
Yeah, so look, I was going to make the point about how, Nick talked about the policy implications or the policy impacts on beyond directly on particular farm businesses, but on the economy more widely, and how that starts to filter through and drive change and provide incentives. From this year, in fact, in Australia, starting at the very large business level, we will have mandatory ESG reporting that goes to Scope 3. So you will have the very big processors and retailers that will need to be reporting on their Scope 3 emissions, which will bring it back to a farm level. Now, that is understood. It's providing clear signals of the need to supply, how that sort of data is going to be provided through the supply chains. And already we're starting to see that enabled in really interesting ways. So, for instance, one of our online livestock auction sites here has now done has an arrangement with one of the more popular carbon baselining calculator tools, and farmers can elect, totally voluntarily, to attach the data from that baselining tool to the cattle that are put up as a lot on that auction site. And so the purchasers of those cattle are able to see the carbon baseline data from the farm where the cattle have been produced. And that is already, in some cases where that data is being provided, providing a small premium to the people that are putting the cattle up. Now, that's the sort of thing I think that we'll start to see as we have those incentives coming through, because the people at the end of the supply chain that have been compelled to provide that data now legislatively, it's a way they can get it and acquire it. And they'll initially, and I'm not sort of one that says this will be rivers of gold and premiums forever, but, for first movers and being able to do that and demonstrate that, there will be these sorts of premiums available, I think.
Are Australian ranchers or producers engaged on this, Richard?
They're all engaged in one way or another, some positively and some very negatively, as you could imagine. And wherever you go around the world, there are varying attitudes about whether this is a positive or a negative thing. I think, and certainly, obviously, my position and the CRC is that we can do this in a way that increases productivity and profitability. When there's a very simple equation in this, in that if you've got carbon in grass or feed and it's going through an animal and up into the air as an emission, then that's waste. If that carbon can be captured in the productivity of the animal, then it's a productivity gain. We just need to work out how to do that economically. And I think we can do that. I think there's a lot of technologies that are coming through that will enable us to get productivity and profitability gains while reducing emissions.
That just triggered a thought here, Brenna. The upcycling of food waste, is that something that we need to also take into consideration, or the upcycling of other things that aren't of such value? Do we need to take that into consideration when we're doing the overall math on emissions in cattle production?
I think there's one, and we were talking about policy earlier, and I think this is one where we need to recognize that governments have multiple objectives. And they're not just the climate agenda, it's also biodiversity and protecting grasslands. And therefore, there's a recognition, and there needs to be a recognition, that ruminants are how you protect that biodiversity in grasslands and provide a nutrient-dense protein to go with it. And that's one where once you recognize that, it's not about is Australia or Canada having the lower emissions intensity. It's the fact that wherever we're at, we're both striving to reduce our emissions intensity in both countries while recognizing the benefits that ruminants provide on the landscape. And one of those is the upcycling story of being able to use, whether it's feed grains that are not fit for human consumption and therefore go into the feed sector for livestock, whether it's other things that come through that are suitable for cattle to upcycle. And this is part of the circular economy conversation that's been going on, that the livestock sector has been a part of for time immemorial. And it's one that is frequently under the radar, that we don't talk about or think about, but is really part of this overall conversation of recognizing how these circular economies actually function and the upcycling that livestock provide.
All right. Final question then, or topic that we can discuss, and this might be putting you on the spot, especially Brenna maybe, but I apologize ahead of time. Do we see more cattle, or should we grow from an emissions perspective, given Canada's carbon intensity when it comes to beef production? Should policy help or hinder the growth of cattle production in Canada?
And that actually is what I was just talking about, is the fact that as a relatively low emissions intensity producer of beef, there is actually a role for Canada to increase livestock inventories, increase production and exports, with the intentional goal of displacing high emissions intensity production that is on the international market. Recognizing that it is a competitive sphere, but that everyone needs to be doing their piece in terms of reducing emissions, and that these landscapes are protected by having cattle on them.
Yeah, all those other aspects too that need to be taken into consideration. Nick, do you support what Brenna says there in terms of? I know that requires maybe a more global perspective on reaching a net zero emissions position by 2050.
Absolutely. And I think it can go a step further in that when we look at any natural system, it involves animals. And so when we're talking about agriculture, it needs to involve animals. And there's a huge opportunity here, not only for farmers to work towards their own and the agricultural side, but also be the heroes for other industries as well. I mentioned anaerobic biodigestion earlier, and I know I'm harping on that, even though it's only 20% of the emissions of the cow. But I mean, if we can offset some fossil fuels with renewable natural gas, that's a double whammy, and that's a huge benefit from an agricultural perspective, from an industry perspective, and from a regional perspective. So that's a direction that I think we really want to take. And like Brenna said, I mean, it's not about should we do more or should we do less. It's how do we do less bad together, and this takes a sector to do, and it takes an industry to do, and it's not a pork versus beef versus lentils. It's how do we work as a system here to make an agricultural system that provides healthy soils, provides low emission products, and can feed people effectively into the future.
Yeah. Richard, final thoughts then on this topic of discussion. I know you're seeing it from an Australian context, but what do you see in terms of the future of the livestock industry down under?
Well, globally, not just down under, I think the future is bright. And I think what will help that future is we need, in the policy sphere, we need to get a hell of a lot better at understanding emissions reduction trade-offs. You know, we don't do that very well at all. We just measure the emissions coming out without sort of looking at, well, what's the consequences of reducing these emissions, particularly in terms of livestock production. We could just say we need less methane, let's have less cattle. Well, what happens to the pasture that the cattle were grazing on? Do we even know the carbon emissions from pasture just left alone? Because there is some evidence now, even methane, emissions in the Australian context, when you've got things like termites and other insect activity that actually release methane as well. We haven't quantified that. We don't know well managed, and that's the big caveat on all of this. It needs to be well managed. It needs to be best farming practice, and we can continue to improve emissions through better farming practice. But understanding what all the trade-offs are, putting that into a more nuanced policy position than just gross emissions, and if we can do that well, I think animal agriculture has a place and a very bright place in the future.
Yeah, well said. All three of you, great points. And I know it feels like we're just starting to scratch the surface on this topic, but and we're 40 minutes in. So I want to say thank you on behalf of Cappy and Real Agriculture, Brenna, Nick, and Richard for taking the time and engaging on this discussion, sharing your insight and your expertise on this topic. And we look forward to further conversations down the road on this topic as well. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.